A very, very warm welcome to everybody. My name is Christoph Emmerich, and I have the honor to be chairing our event today. Welcome to the book launch of Seeing China's Belt and Road, edited by Edward Schatz and Rachel Silvey. This is the book we'll be presenting today, and we'll be hearing from the editors. We'll be hearing some comments from the two discussants we've invited. And I'm very happy to be opening this and moderating. I myself am from the Department of the Study of Religion. I work on Buddhism in Nepal and South Asia. And when I was thinking about a possible connection, I was thinking that actually I do teach about the Noble Eightfold Path and the Middle Way, which may have a distant connection to roads and belts. We have today with us Edward Schatz, second and from my side here, who is Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for European and Eurasian Studies at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. He is the author of Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia, 2021, Modern Clan Politics, 2004, as well as the editor of Paradox of Power, The Logics of State Weakness in Eurasia, 2017, and Political Ethnography, What Immersion Contributes to the Study of Power, 2009. We have with us a co-editor, Rachel Silvey, who is Professor of Geography and Planning and the Richard Charles Lee Director of the Asian Institute at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. Her work has been published in the fields of migration studies, cultural and political geography, gender studies, and critical development studies. Her research has focused on migration, gender, and development in Indonesia, as well as Southeast Asian migration to the Gulf states and North America. She's currently researching labor migration associated with Belt Road Initiative projects in Southeast Asia, as well as the migration regimes associated with expansion of plantations in Southeast Asia. Rachel has been a very dear colleague, close colleague of mine, as director of the Asian Institute. We have with us today two colleagues of ours who will comment on the book. One is Catherine Rankin, second from the end, who is Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Her broad research interests include gender and development, comparative market regulation, financial restructuring, planning history, and theory in South Asia. She is currently conducting research on the politics of road development in Nepal. She is author of The Cultural Politics of Markets, Economic Liberalization and Social Change in Nepal, 2004, as well as journal articles in Economy and Society, International Planning Studies, Journal of Feminist Economics, Gender, Place and Culture, and Progress in Human Geography. We also have with us Dan Fu, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto and a Fellow at Brookings Institution, the Wilson Center, and the National Committee on US-China Relations. Her research examines popular contention, repression, civil society, and authoritarian citizenship in contemporary China. She is currently co-authoring a second book examining how the Chinese state governs the global diaspora. She's the author of Mobilizing Without the Masses, Controlling Contention in China, published in 2018, which is also presented here in one of our rounds, and which won Best Book Awards for the American Political Science Association and American Sociological Association and the International Studies Association, multi-premium book. I'm very happy to have my colleagues with us today. I'm very happy to have all of you here. I'd like to this point congratulate my two colleagues for this amazing achievement, for this wonderful book, and would like to also congratulate all those who may have contributed to the book who are in the audience with us today. Let us congratulate and welcome our panel and our editors together.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you all of you for being here. This is a day we've been really looking forward to because we get to share the celebration of a long period of work that has involved a lot of people and a lot of people's patience, their continued involvement, and their trust in us that this would come to this day, that we could actually share it publicly. So very specifically, I would like to thank a number of our contributors to start with here. And we actually have a picture of our chapter contributors. So when you create a collected volume such as this, you depend on all of these individuals to write their wonderful chapters, add their perspectives, and they've all done an extraordinary job. Hopefully we'll hear from some of them a bit later. So thank you to all the contributors, one of whom is here, Professor Paul Thiel. I'd also like this chance to say a specific thanks to the co-editor here, who really did the lion's share of all of this and deserves all the thanks from everyone. Finally, at the end of writing all of our extensive acknowledgements to the institutions and the funding sources and the colleagues in the office who helped us do all of this and have the conferences, Ed had the really good idea of dedicating the book to our families. And I won't read the whole dedication, but I will say to our families near and far, words can't really express the thanks that we have to all of you. I'm sure there's a lot more thanks that I should be giving here, specifically to our panelists and to all of you for being here, but I'll have a chance to say thank you, hopefully in the end, in person. And also Ed wants to say a few words about the actual book, so because we know that's what you're here for. Thanks.
Okay. I'm gonna sit and how do I get this? I guess they're all on. Okay. If you don't mind, just so that we don't have to
Yes.
do the sort of juggling act. Thanks to everybody who's here. Thanks especially to everyone who's involved in one way or another in the project. Jeremy's here. We also have a couple of other chapter authors online. I only see two, so I see Jasmine and Marina. Maybe there's somebody else whose image does not appear, but in the background, as it were, there are a lot of contributors, and it was truly a joy to work with this group. It started during COVID. It evolved during mature COVID, and then it of course came to fruition in whatever period we're calling this period, right? I guess we're not post-COVID because you're never post-COVID, but here we are. I also want to just add to the chorus of thanks, just one specific thanks to Arba for running this event. And a lot goes into an event like this, and so to Arba and to the tech team in the back, Adam and others, thank you so much for everything that you do. This has been a great experience in part because of how easy it is to work with Rachel. And because we learn so much from, I think, exposing ourselves to people who work in areas that are adjacent to your own, right? There's nothing quite like expanding your horizons by, if you're a political scientist, speaking to a human geographer and thinking, what? What do you mean by? And then a conversation ensues, right? And hopefully it goes the other way as well. But it's truly a terrific sort of intellectual endeavor, and one that actually expands horizons in a terrific way. And the other thing to say here is that Monk is the great place for this sort of interdisciplinary and cross-regional kind of work. We were particularly delighted to have the support of Monk and to be able to have conversation across regions. My focus is on sort of Eurasia, former Soviet space in particular, and Rachel's is on Southeast Asia in particular. And we don't often have conversations across regions, and I think we ought to, but in ways that are grounded. And I think that that's what the chapter authors really contributed to. So let me walk through the table of contents a little bit to give you a sense of the scope of the book. So if I could get the next slide. Magic. Oh, magic happens with the push of a button. Okay. I want to emphasize that each chapter that you see here, and sorry for the small print, I wanted to get it on one slide, offers remarkable empirical coverage. And I think each chapter can be read on its own. What makes this volume, I think, stand out is this empirical coverage. These are people really working at the ground level, often ethnographically, but they're brought together and I would say in some ways forced into a common conversation. This, I think, is pretty unusual, and I think in some ways revelatory. Rachel will have more to say about the themes of the volume, but the volume also weaves together two major theoretical and conceptual threads that are evident throughout the contributions. So let me just go through the different parts, and I'll say just a word about each chapter. We could spend a lot more time on each chapter because they're so good, okay? But I just encourage you to have a look. The first part of the book covers key aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative's materiality. After all, the Belt and Road is about infrastructure. It's $1 trillion program of investment and investment financing. It helps to create bridges, roads, ports, cables, and so on. And these are necessarily material. It's hard to escape that, and therefore I would say necessarily political. Ed Lemon and Bradley Jardin's chapter reminds us that the BRI is an initiative that is intertwined with forms of hard power. And they look at this in the context of former Soviet Central Asia, looking at China's involvement that has paved the way by the BRI into that region. Tom Nairns in the next chapter shows us that lending and debt, and indeed debt forgiveness or ongoing indebtedness, as the case may be, are in part political questions. And he investigates the discussions about the debt trap, the notion that China is purposefully constructing opportunities to indebt countries so that it can then seize those countries' assets. And he explores that in a critical vein. Jeremy Paltiel, right here, and his co-author Carl Yan show us that the BRI emerges from a very specific bureaucratic milieu in the Chinese state, which continues to shape its rollout across different parts of the world. The second part of the book shifts away from a focus on hard materiality to consider how this materiality is represented, right? How bridges, how ports, how IT infrastructure, and so on are represented. So Marina Canetti, hello Marina, I see your image, I don't see your moving face, looks at an important exhibit that was organized by China, bringing together countries along the so-called Silk Road, which she says about the exhibit was, quote, meant as a spectacular display of a world of common past and shared future stretching from Japan to Slovenia and Mongolia to Oman. Galen Merton then considers what silences or absences in cartographic space may say about the Belt and Road. In other words, what it means to, what the architects of the BRI mean when they reveal or conceal the materiality of the BRI. Jess DiCarlo builds upon this question of visibility, which runs through our through the volume. Rachel will have more to say, and she considers the interplay between the low visibility aspects, in other words, the things that are meant to be away from the public view, and the high visibility aspects of the BRI, the things that are trumpeted by China and the Chinese and Chinese associated actors. The third part returns to the BRI's materiality, showing what happens largely out of sight. Of course, not entirely out of sight, but it's designed to be beneath the radar. So Lena Kaufman considers the fascinating case of China's scarcely visible IT role in Switzerland. Not often talked about, but fascinating case there. Jasmine, hello Jazz, Dalagnola looks at how Central Asians view the Chinese surveillance cameras that are in turn viewing them on the streets of Almaty, Bishkek, and other places. And finally, Ding Fei looks at the lived experiences of Chinese expatriates in Ethiopia, reminding us that these giant infrastructure projects are in fact populated by human beings up and down the dimensions of this project. And it is hard to escape the very human nature of how this is rolled out in concrete places. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of the key themes that runs through the book, as Ed's already mentioned, and that you can see in the way the table of contents is divided, is the politics of sight. So seeing, the ways that the Belt and Road is seen depends, of course, on disciplinary perspective, also on location, and also on all the access or lack of access that people have to various sources of knowledge. So we hope that what this book offers is not just a thread for thinking from all these different places about how China's Belt and Road is unfolding, but also an ontological or an epistemological contribution to thinking about the ways that perception is deeply political and the ways of seeing the Belt and Road not only have a politics embedded in them, but produce a set of politics that have effects of their own. And so what I'm hoping is that that theme of ways of seeing and the ways the different authors saw their field work and saw the Belt and Road from their own field work perspectives will open up a set of debates. I think this was our hope for the book as a whole, is that people could really take from this way of seeing itself a way of thinking about their own work and the methodological implications of their own work and the conceptual baggage that people carry, whether or not we know it. So unpacking ways of seeing seems also a really appropriate theme for thinking about global affairs today and thinking about what area studies might be able to do in the future. And I'm sure you will have questions for us about how you see what this book has to offer to your work. And I'm sure our discussants will have a lot to say specifically about that as well. Thanks.
And before we turn it over to the discussant, just one, it's the second theme. So the first theme is seeing, it's in the title. The second sort of conceptual intervention is something that we call looking downstream. So there's the element of sight there, but thinking downstream in terms of cause and effect. And it's an invitation that we hope to take seriously to think beyond immediate cause and effect, right? Immediate cause, and we get a lot of that. China disperses so much money. It is building so many ports. It is underwriting so many initiatives. A port is built or not. The cover of the book, you'll see there's an unfinished project. So that might be considered a provisional outcome of the BRI. But this is all fairly short term, and we want to invite thinking about the longer term processes that we think are set in motion. This is in a way hard stuff, but but we think that the epistemology that this invites is useful. And so we use this analogy. We envision political and social change as something akin to what happens in hydrological basins, whereby sediment can be produced in one location, can travel great distances, and can affect destinations that are far downstream from its origins. In this process, there are clear forces at play. And you can describe those forces. You can even roughly begin to predict the downstream effects. And there's a clear direction in which these forces are acting. So it's not as if you can't think into the problem at all. But the effects that we see are provisional, and they're extremely hard to predict with precision. And I think this induces a certain degree of humility when we think into projects at least as big as this one. And so this is kind of how we try to think about the BRI. It may be geopolitical in its design, and we can certainly talk about that, but its effects, its geopolitical effects and its other kinds of effects, social, political, cultural even, are not something that you can deduce from the design itself. Neither what we call in the book of the Beijing narrative nor the Washington narrative about the BRI does justice to its varied and changing impact. In fact, I was thinking, and Rachel's going to kill me, maybe, if she disagrees. Okay, maybe. Okay, well, yeah, you don't know? Maybe, okay. One way, I think, to think about Elon Musk's efforts to eviscerate USAID is that it's a downstream reaction to China's BRI. It's the Trump, are you running with me? Okay. It's the Trump administration's attempt to embrace a more transactional, shamelessly strategic, not to mention unapologetically self-serving way to do what we used to call soft power. None of this was deducible from the BRI when it was launched under a different name in 2013. And yet I think it becomes legible when we think about that as a reaction downstream to the BRI. The final thing I want to say is this: the BRI is changing as, you know, in our post-COVID era, as China's economy in a relative sense slows, and as China seems keen on being more selective and in its efforts and in encouraging higher quality projects. Where this takes us is anyone's guess, but we think that gazing downstream allows us to position ourselves to think about the longer term impact without getting caught up in debates about proximate causes and immediate effects.
Hey, great. Hello, everyone. Congratulations again to you too and to the contributors. I remember it feels like yesterday that Rachel and Ed convened a workshop of the participant or the authors in this book. That was 2021, and from in my register, I guess that is a bit like a stroke of magic that you moved so quickly to the production of the volume since then. So congratulations. There is by now a lot of scholarship on BRI, even from the social sciences. So I figured my task was to think about what's special about this one. And I'm with you actually on your brief mention of AID because, I mean, it's a throwaway, but it is timely, my goodness, right? It couldn't be more timely with, in the context of Trump's dismantling of US, or I could say Musk's dismantling of USAID and how AID and how that plays directly into China's expanding global investments and influence, right? And as you also likely know, former director Samantha Powers, have you been reading what she's been speaking and writing about this moment? What I saw was in the New York Times about when the ground game in US foreign policy that is USAID kind of disappears beneath our feet, that paves the way for Beijing, as she put it in the Times, to become the partner of choice, right? To become the partner of choice around the world. So, I don't know about all of you, but given my training in critical development studies and post-colonial studies, USAID had always been the target, right? The target for our critique. But now that was certainly premised on taking for granted certain expectations, right, about the responsibility of humanitarian and development aid in the post-world order. And suddenly those modernist tropes in the current conjuncture are starting to look pretty good. And I think this book becomes imperative in that context. But anyway, in addition to that basic point about how we all have to quickly and now, understand China and understand Chinese models of development, I do think there are two features that are more internal or integral to the book that should catch our immediate attention. And one, thankfully, you've talked about already, which is the yes, it is a collection of phenomenal ethnographic, empirical work in multiple sites downstream of the centers of the generation of BRI, and that's important in its own right. It also makes this epistemological intervention about the politics of sight and looking downstream, which I think really does cohere the volume and make an important intervention. So this is a book about China and its geopolitics, but it's a book about China via accounts of how this phenomenal transnational transformative thing, BRI, manifests differently, right? In Laos and Switzerland, I won't get all the places, Ethiopia, the Himalayas. And that allows us to explore differences in its reception. And that's what the point is, I think, of the politics of sight. So in this sense, the book is it is the case that there is a fair amount of work on BRI that similarly focuses on the seeing it from the ground. It's attuned to the particularities of contexts and processes located on the receiving end of BRI. And why is that important? Why is it important to do that? I mean, as they put it, Rachel and Ed, we can't paint an accurate picture using broad brushstrokes. We need to understand what is really going on, this is me now, to capture the layers, the contestations and specifications of development processes, specificities of development processes that unfold under the banner of BRI. So they also extrapolate from that claim about it's important to see the reception of such a phenomenal, massive undertaking. They also extrapolate to say why it's important is that we need frameworks for understanding massive transnational transformational processes, such as the ones we're in the midst of today, right? So that's the impetus for them to develop this metaphor of seeing. And they say, and they write, it's quite lovely. They write, looking downstream is an invitation to a broad way of seeing politics and their geographies as they unfold. And here they can, and this is the epistemological intervention, right? Which I think certainly does go beyond the norm of an edited volume. Asking how BRI projects are seen locally, as they do, points to looking at the social and political ramifications of different ways of seeing, right? And in doing so, it foregrounds tensions and contradictions that aren't so evident when you're just looking at BRI as an investment rooted in, as a practice of investment rooted in Beijing. And I also think what's kind of extraordinary or interesting about the book is that this epistemological claim also, as Rachel alluded to, allows an ontological claim, right? So that what people see, what they see is contingent on their lines of sight. You've gone through the chapters already, and so I won't go there too. I think the chapters really show that beautifully, and I'm not going to get into that as I might have. I really love that move in this book, and it also made me wonder, is this what you call the ontological move? I mean, is this kind of basic, old-fashioned humanistic ethnography, right? That, where the purpose is to understand local points of view in order, to make the world safe for difference, or in order to learn something about the world, in order to learn something about ourselves, the old, make the strange familiar bit. I mean, it did. Make the familiar strange, thank you. It did make me think about the book as a kind of meta ethnography in that sense. And then, okay, so the second distinctive point about the book, I thought, is that it's co-edited by a political scientist and a geographer. And to me, as a student of the BRI, that is quite a generative collaboration. Because, and I may get this wrong, but from the political science perspective, we get to learn about how the textured and situated views of BRI elaborated in the volume work to decenter not just one, which I'm used to thinking about, but two hegemonic polar narratives that comprise US-China geopolitical rivalries, right? The one that we see from here that sees BRI as part of an increasingly assertive Chinese foreign policy grounded in, that alternative model of development that Samantha Powers has been writing about and worrying about. But the other that is centered in Beijing and the CCP, that BRI is essentially beneficial, right? And it's a win-win arrangement that's good for both the perpetrators and the beneficiaries of development. So we get to understand how both these narratives comprising the US, the China geopolitical rivalry posit BRI as this coherent unitary vision. And most important for me from political science, I think, is the impetus to look for patterns and identifiable directions in the flow of power that are raised in this process of decentering that unitary vision. But at the same time, the relational approach of geography is at work here. And, you know, it is through geography that we move beyond the materiality of plans and programs, as Rachel already noted, to on, you know, what else is going on the ground, which has to do with shifting social meanings, lived local encounters that do the work of challenging those easy cause-effect claims that are so often associated with development in general, and that offer a wider range of possibilities for how change happens, which is also kind of a meta-narrative or a meta-question of the book, how change happens. And it's interesting that one of the contributors of the volume, Jessica DiCarlo, has another edited volume called The Rise of the Infrastructural State, which kind of intersects really nicely with this volume, because the volume does point to the range of the range of actors and institutions and relationships within receiving states of BRI, and what are, you know, kind of asks or probes what are their capacities to control the terms of that encounter, right? And Jessica's book does that well, and I think this book kind of points to or situates all that work within this logic of the politics of sight. So as I read, I kind of played a bit of a game with myself, which was I was trying to guess which of the co-editors wrote which sections. And I think I did pretty well, because I do think that the disciplinary differences manifest too, like it's a collaboration, and it's also a difference. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall and know where the sticky points may have been. But I would say that for me, what I noticed when I was looking at that sweet dynamic was sometimes it read as if the flow was one way, right? And sometimes the focus seemed to be on the possibility of recursive flows. So what that, you know, that seemed to be a tension for me. The phrase downstream effects does for me suggest a kind of unidirectional flow, impact modality that the volume seems to want to reject. But then I thought, okay, so the formulation looking downstream, on the other hand, might kind of overlook what are some of the specific strategies undertaken within the BRI operation from the center, right? To control and condition vision. Like, is that what is seen and not seen? Is that part of what is seen and not seen covered here? And if not, why not? And then with all the emphasis on variation, contingency, complexity, specificity, indeterminacy, I sometimes did have a hard time figuring out what the patterns are. I love that. I love to look for the patterns, but and so it was helpful to be reminded about the structure of the book. And I suppose those are the patterns. But you know, how you know them when you see them maybe is another way to convert that question. So I'll just end by saying another thing that I loved about the book that I think makes it stand out and is much needed in this time of insurgent fascism, shall we say, and that is that it's offering, you know, through all this, downstream viewing and politics of sight and interdisciplinarity, a framework that is robust and flexible, I'm quoting them here, to the task of making sense of transformation. So robust and flexible to the task of making sense of transformation. And the framework is simple, actually, and apt for our times. And it is to, if I could just simplify it, find out what's happening on the ground by looking relationally downstream, then look back upstream to the transnational transformational force in question. For them, it's BRI, but we could also think about insurgent fascism, and ask how the politics of sight help us to better understand the thing, BRI, in light of the outcomes and processes that have been revealed. And I would just only add, wondering if there's a fourth, which is there anything about the work which is kind of signaled to, but I was curious about in all of that is about identifying conditions of possibility for counter-hegemonic processes, kind of amidst all that indeterminacy, or to pose it as a question, are there some visions that are more important from a social justice point of view, that are more clarifying? How would we know which those are? Like, what does this work tell us about that piece of seeing, or that dimension of seeing? So thank you.
Well, I'm really happy to be celebrating with Ed and Rachel and all of you this intellectual project. And I call this an intellectual project because I really think that's what it is. It's not just, I mean, it's presented in the form of a book, but it really is an intellectual project that really is what Monk is all about, which is bringing people from different perspectives, different disciplines, people from, we have colleagues here from the Asian Institute and CEAS and many other institutions that have really come together to study not just the BRI, but really how do you study? So it's a more ontological question that Rachel talked about earlier. How do you actually study something like the BRI? Because the BRI is like, it's like this like kind of nebulous project that is also fragmented. And the way I describe it to my students when I'm teaching about the BRI is I just give them a couple of facts. I just say, look, in 2023, when the Council on Foreign Relations was writing about the BRI, they said that 40% of the world's GDP, the BRI constituted 40% of the world's GDP, and 2/3 of the world's population live in a BRI country. So how do you study something as massive and as nebulous and as like grand as that? And I think that's really why this is an intellectual project, because coming from sort of like having one foot in the policy world, I can tell you the way that people in the policy world talk about the BRI, which is something that Ed and Rachel also mentioned in their introduction, which is it's always talked about in two ways. First, the policy people in DC and in Washington and elsewhere talk about it as China undermining the international liberal order, right? China is building these things, it's expanding its soft power, its coercive power, it's reaching its tentacles everywhere, and therefore it is undermining the international liberal order. The second way they talk about it is, what exactly is Beijing's intention? Is Beijing out to get people? Is it a malevolent power trying to expand its surveillance technology, trying to export its authoritarian governance model through the BRI? Or is this just like exactly what Beijing says, which is that we're expanding our soft power, our influence, our culture, and our language? And yes, Pakistani children now can speak Chinese, but there's nothing malevolent about that, right? So that's like the sort of two nodes of discussion in the policy world whenever we talk about the BRI, and there's so many books written along those two themes of like China's threat in terms of its like a global expansion, as well as in terms of like what's Beijing's intention, right? And I think this book or this intellectual project is a breath of fresh air because it provides a really different lens for looking at the BRI, and this lens has to do with all of the contributors as well as Rachel and Ed, even though they come from different disciplines. What ties them both together is this great detail and attention and commitment to looking at agency and to looking at people on the ground and how they experience the BRI. How is the BRI projects? How are these dams that are being built through the BRI? How are these like roads that are being constructed? How is that actually implemented and affecting people on the ground? How is it affecting like migrant workers from China who are actually sent to various places in the world to actually carry out these construction projects? How do people who are being surveilled by CCTV cameras that are exported by China along the digital Silk Road, how are they experiencing the BRI? And so that's why this volume is so, I love it so much, is because it really provides an ethnographic perspective into understanding, like we keep talking about the downstream effects, like basically in ethnography, it's basically like what Ed talked about earlier in his like volume that's been cited so many times about ethnographic immersion and really getting your having the scholar be immersed knee deep in understanding how people experience and interpret something that's been happening. So in this sense, their book, their intellectual project is not just about interpreting what Beijing's intentions are, what the statecraft behind BRI is, but actually about how people on the ground both experience BRI as well as negotiate with it, as well as react to it and resist it. And that's what's so great about the book. And all of the chapters that run throughout it, they really like weighs in on this question of how it's being experienced on the ground. And so this volume plays around a lot with the multiple meanings of seeing. Like they have the whole like section on the politics of sight and what that means. And I think it was James Scott who wrote in his book about seeing like a state, right? That seeing means to render the populations legible that are in various countries in order to govern them. But for Ed and Rachel and the people in this who contributed to this volume, seeing has also multiple meanings in the sense of, again, how do people on the ground see projects of the BRI and how do they push back and how do they interpret things that in a way that maybe Washington or Ottawa has not really been attuned to, and they haven't really been attuned to that. So I just want to say a little bit, give a couple of concrete examples from the book to illustrate how these contributions really give us a sense of people seeing things on the ground. So one of the contributions that they start with in the book really addresses this thing that actually has caused quite a bit of alarm in policy circles, which is this digital Silk Road. By the way, they have every kind of Silk Road, right? They have like the actual physical like road and belt, and then they have like polar Silk Road. They have like digital Silk Road. They have the green Silk Road. They have the health Silk Road. Like Silk Road this project has become so immense. So one of the things that is really has been alarming people is the digital Silk Road. And what is meant by that is just like China's exportation of or exports of its surveillance technology and other kinds of technology abroad all over the world, including in this particular chapter, they were looking at China's exportation of surveillance technology in Central Asian states, in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan and in Tajikistan. And I just want to say that, yeah, obviously Chinese companies like Hikvision and Huawei and Dahua are definitely selling their technologies and cameras to many states, including those authoritarian states in Central Asia. But obviously they're not the only ones, like American and Canadian companies and other companies are also doing the same thing. And I think if we were to adopt just a policy top-down lens to look at this phenomenon, the story of the digital Silk Road would end there, because it would be a story, again, about the expansion of China's statecraft, the expansion of surveillance power, the expansion of its own sort of exportation of surveillance authoritarian power abroad. The story would end there if you were just gonna remain on that level of analysis. But what I like about this chapter, I think it was written by Jasmine Dal-Agnola, sorry, I butchered your name, actually shows that through surveys and other kinds of research on the ground in these Central Asian countries, their findings actually show that the installation of CCTV cameras that are exported by China to those countries, actually people on the ground appreciate them. They actually don't mind being surveilled. They actually think it improves safety, it improves crime, and there's actually widespread popular support for CCTV cameras. well, there you go. Like Washington would say, oh, this is terrible. I mean, it does lend itself to human rights abuses, and that's documented in the book. But at the same time, it's also important to understand that people, ordinary people on the ground, people that are not necessarily involved in politics, especially women. I think the chapter also shows an interesting gender dynamic that women on the ground say, hey, this is actually making the streets safer for us. And it's actually good that, we have CCTV cameras everywhere now. And I think that this is an interesting, when I was reading that, it reminded me that this is actually not specific to those citizens in Central Asia, because there's been surveys recently, I remember a couple of years ago done, showing that there's over 80% support in China by ordinary Chinese people of a similar, not of CCTV cameras, but of the social credit system, which had raised eyebrows and grabbed headlines a number of years ago because it was seen as China's Black Mirror system. It was, seen as this new age way to deal with political dissidents and to just generally control the population. And in many ways, those are not completely false claims, but it is also important to remember that people living in different political contexts, and especially in authoritarian regimes where you don't really have the same expectations for privacy that you would here necessarily, they feel okay about those CCTV cameras. So I just wanted to give that one example, just to give you, bring to life one of the chapters that really, you wouldn't really be able to get this perspective had you not provided the ontological grounds for looking at this project from the downstream effects. And I'll just give one more example from the book. There is another chapter that's talking about the transformation of the security space in Central Asia as a result of China's intervention. I think this is the first chapter they start with, which is the one by Edward Lemon and Bradley Jardine. And they show that the BRI is not just about expanding soft power, it is also about establishing and bolstering a security network in Central Asia that makes those countries hierarchically codependent on China. I'm borrowing directly from their words, hierarchically codependent on China. And they examined this case through a case of, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Sitted, which is a Chinese military base on the remote corners of the Pashmir Mountains in Tajikistan, which I'm pretty sure in this room, maybe only Ed has been to that area of the world. They sort of trace how China has expanded its regional security services networks across Central Asia through the BRI. So what does this mean? What does this tell us? I think the authors make this point, and I'll make it even more in a different way from the way they made this point, which is that the BRI is not just a host of economic projects. While its intention may be largely economic to begin with, there is military baggage that comes with it, right? If you are building dams and building roads and mines and whatnot, infrastructure in other places, you're sending your people there, they need protection. You need protection for your assets abroad. You need protection for your people that are abroad. And therefore, it comes with military baggage. It comes with coercive baggage. And so this is why, while those military installations are not the main projects that the BRI might have set out to do, they come with the territory because, again, you need that whole infrastructure to protect your investments abroad. And so what this tells us is that the result is that these military installations also, not only beyond just protecting the assets out there, they also facilitate security cooperations between Beijing and the host states, leading to operations that may not have been the initial intention of the BRI, but end up being an effect of the BRI. And so this chapter documents, for example, how the military base that is in Tajikistan, which has like a landing, like a helicopter landing pad and about 300 people on the ground. It documents how this military base facilitated cooperation between China's security services and their Tajikistan equivalent, resulting in raids against Uyghur businesses in Tajikistan. And so this is just one of the one of many sort of unintended and negative consequences, I think, of the BRI. And you could only really think about that or really notice that or really document that, again, if you were embarked in this kind of grounded project, which this book does. I could have given like 10 more examples through all of the chapters that are in this book, of which another chapter discussed labor migration, which I thought was really interesting because I studied labor migration, and Rachel does too, of Chinese workers who have been sent to these places, and just that whole labor regime that gets implemented on the ground. But all this to say that I think this book is really going to be around for a while, not just because it's addressing an important empirical initiative that is unfolding, and not just because the BRI has implications for geopolitics, but also because it reminds us again and again that it is important to look at things that are going around, projects and things that are going around us in the world through an on-the-ground perspective, because at the end of the day, why do we care about these things? Because they impact people's lives. And if you don't understand and don't study those downstream effects, then you kind of are just in the policy space that I don't really appreciate as much, which is just like all about geopolitical power and tit for tat and power spheres of influence. And I'm like, no, policy is about people. Policy intervention is about people. In order to understand how these interventions are affecting people, you got to study people on the ground. So, thank you.
Before we have the editors, the co-editors react, I'd like to thank Catherine for being with us in spite of her obligations, teaching obligations, which you have to.
I have to teach a class. So bye.
So thanks so much for those comments, Diana, and thank you, Catherine, for yours as well. I think what's really been highlighted by all of the comments is that the ways that US-China tensions are represented in the newspapers, whether it's about AI competition or semiconductor restrictions or fears of technological decoupling, all those binaries are really missing the layered stories that the book is does tell. And so the refusal of those binaries is really a key inspiration for the volume. And it's more than just a critique of those dominant narratives. It's actually also an argument for deeper engagement with the understanding of the complexity, as you say, in people's lives and specific places. And an ethnography or a set of methodologies for today, because the actors and the geographies of political power are changing so rapidly that it only makes sense to start to methodologically approach them in creative fashion that allows interdisciplinary dialogue to come to the forefront, that allows us to rethink our regional specializations in relation to other sources of knowledge. And so I just wanted to kind of finish and respond to say, you know, the hope is that it's not just a critique, though it is all of those things. It's also an emphasis on the importance of being in particular places and learning the languages of those places and the people you're interacting with, and allowing that immersion to reshape what we think we know and see.
Yeah, I mean, we can end on that, but I guess, part of me wants to respond to Catherine, but Catherine's not here, so I will probably say a couple of things. But I do think she puts several really important things on the table, and good on her to notice which sections, maybe she got it right, were written by myself and which were by Rachel. I do think that they're, you know, you come with your own disciplinary perspectives for sure. She did mention, you know, she lumped it into the political science side of things, you know, the search for patterns. So I'll accept that as, you know, maybe a little bit more of what we're up to in my discipline. Here, I guess I want to say a couple of things. First of all, you know, when you're proceeding ground up and inductively, largely, right? It's not as if you go in without any preconceptions or theoretical consideration and so on. But when you're trying to proceed from that, figuring out what's happening downstream, as Catherine put it, so that you can then look upstream and think about what that means for the upstream. the original force, let's put it that way, it becomes very hard to discern patterns, right? It's not that it's impossible. And so one could talk about patterns. One could talk about where you see, resistance to Chinese, where you see anti-Chinese sentiment, let's say, emerging in different contexts. So you certainly see that. And I think the first chapter by Ed Lemon and Bradley Jardine gets into this a little bit. You see this in parts of Central Asia, where you can actually where you can run these kinds of public opinion surveys, and you can document the extent to which people start to view China in a negative light. Now, you can't necessarily trace that to specific things because it gets very methodologically challenging, but that's only in Central Asian context. And we don't have comparable, at the moment, data in other kinds of places. Doesn't mean it can't be done. And I would encourage PhD students, hi Irina, to do it. Kira, you're next on the list. Okay, to actually do this kind of work, search for patterns, but at the same time be humble, because a lot of the outcomes that we think are outcomes are only provisionally stable. Right, things can turn, as it's remarkable what's happening south of the border, but this is in a way and by degree the story everywhere, right? Political scientists like to talk about outcomes, dependent variables, and so on, but the reality is that human societies are changing, or at least have the potential to change at any moment. The one exception, a little bit just in the volume is the Narens chapter, which has a specific sort of outcome and looks at it across different country contexts, looks at degrees of indebtedness and looks at the outcomes, whether China is willing to renegotiate debt and so on. So I encourage people to look at that, but that's not the story really across the volume, because we wanted to represent the rich and quite varied outcomes. But the next step, I think, would be indeed to look for common patterns. But this gets to something else that Catherine said, which is, she was mentioning Jess DeCarlo's book, where the infrastructural state tries to control the terms of the encounter. And this is actually, in a way, the point of the whole thing, right? China can control the money that it spends. It can control the efforts that it makes to structure the relationship. And I think Jeremy wrote about that quite well in this chapter with Carl Yan. But it is really at pains to control how it actually plays out in local contexts, because they don't know those local contexts. Mm-hmm. And even if they knew it incredibly well, there is a degree of indeterminacy, which is, I think, worthy of paying attention to. Diana, thank you so much for your comments. I think you're right. I mean, you started with the nebulousness of the BRI. I mean, it is perhaps the most curious thing that I've encountered, where it seems to be everywhere, but then when you try to, when you try to define its contours, it becomes incredibly difficult to define its contours. We're leading some, scholars to say that it's more a slogan than it is an actual project, or it's not really one thing. And therefore, if the contours are not easily, discerned, then it starts to bleed into other affairs, right? Whether it's cultural, connections, whether it's military, whether it's government to government, whether it's personnel, right? And so there are a whole lot of spaces. There's so many opportunities for, I guess, adjacent questions that we couldn't really get to, but they're necessarily part of this broader conversation. Yeah, I think that's all. We lost Jasmine. I guess it's late in Europe, so
two more.
Two more.
May I just add two more? So I really appreciated your comments and Catherine's also, and I just wanted to add two more, which is one of the questions that sort of lurked in the background for us through writing was, how is this different from the Marshall Plan? In what ways is it actually different? And we didn't try to answer that. It just kind of haunted me constantly. And the parallel kind of cousin question was, how is this different from plain old capitalist rollout and expansion? How are different histories of empire and their expansions differentiated. So I think that then relates to the very last question that Catherine was raising about sort of what spaces of kind of counter-hegemonic possibility might be opening up and being occluded from people's analyses, because we aren't necessarily looking for that. If we're looking at rollout from upstream, then maybe there's not as much attention to the ways that people downstream are, as she said, strategizing. And I don't think that's necessarily a critique of the book. I think, again, it's an invitation to think about kind of Gramscian ways of understanding the contemporary capitalist infrastructural developmental movement and how people are responding to it transnationally. And I just had to add that because I felt those questions really generated that perspective, and I wanted to share that.
This might be the moment to open up to all of you and hear what you may have to say, ask, comment. Yes, please.
Listening to all of you, my comment, I was thinking of CPAW when the hand is still, and then the result were battleships, justification of militarization. So I'm seeing, I mean, that's a very interesting concept because it includes so many different variables. Aid involves friction. Aid is policy. Aid is corruption. Aid does harm, or how it's constructed. And trying to put a skin on all this. This is where I'm extremely, I don't want to say puzzled, but this is what the manifestation is, the justification, because Belt and Road. And who is going to be the Mahan in terms of this arcing it right out, justifying what China is doing? Thank you.
Take 2 or 3 questions.
Yes. Yeah, let's take some more and then group them. There are at this point. That's the thinking. Oh yes, there we are. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have another question. So on the side of like the Chinese government, are there any like ongoing discussions within the government about if VR is a good, good investment or not? Because earlier you brought up how sometimes projects don't actually finish, like on the book cover and all that. I'm just curious, when does that happen? Are there like discussions on, is this a sunk cost or should we keep doing this? I'm just wondering if those types of discussions happen in the Chinese government or not.
Should we take these 2 for now?
1 or 2 more.
Yeah, let's go ahead and chew on these a little bit. I mean, I think, we have China experts in the room, and guess what? They're not us. Okay. I may defer to Jeremy and to Diana on the question of how, because I think it's more of a question of how the Chinese party state reevaluates, right? What's the process by which these kinds of things occur? And what information are they using and what considerations? That's a great question. Just a small little bit on the book cover. So that's a picture from Astana, Kazakhstan. This is a light rail project that was dead. They ran out of financing and it became locally known as a monument to corruption. Just corruption in general, not naming names, but just corruption. And suddenly the project restarted. Now, I don't know the backstory, and I'm not sure how we would know the backstory. Was it becoming an embarrassment for the local regime? Was it becoming an embarrassment for China? Were they on the same page? But they've now they're working 24/7. I don't know if they're done now, but it's getting close to being finished when everyone had given it up for just a monument to corruption that was going to crumble. Maybe we turn it over. I don't know if Jeremy, please, here.
Well, I mean, there's an aspect of the Belt and Road project, which is, I mean, and transparently taken as exporting Chinese governments, but the Chinese governance in a different kind of way. So Xi Jinping says it's not exporting China's governance model per se, it's exporting China's development model. Now, you can't export China's development model without, in some ways, trying to replicate China's governance model. The thing that's most interesting, and it's in our chapter as well, is that it's not very successful. And the Chinese governance model doesn't translate very well in its local situation. And then they have to do all these kinds of songs and dances. And in our chapter, there are some of those songs and dances going in. And what one can take away from, we didn't emphasize it in our chapter, but I think take it away, the Chinese state is not very good at learning. It's good at adapting, but not very good at learning. And so that's in some sense, you know, we're talking about the overall theme about, you know, the thing about USAID and all the rest of it. So you have basically one thing, okay, we're gonna go our way. And basically where there's takers, we'll push. Where there's no takers, we'll step back. If there's obstacles, we'll sort of hang tight. But we're not really learning much as we're going along. And we're not really, in that sense, that the China will be able to expand its scope, maybe, of what it's offering. But whether it actually will be able to do it, and frankly, and given what we say about the Chinese bureaucratic structure in a way, I'm not sure they're even capable of doing it, even if they wanted to.
Do you want to add something to that? No? Okay. Thanks. I was actually, I mean, on that score, and we allude to this in I think the introduction. Rachel and I were at a meeting. Again, I will not name names, but it was a delegation from China, and we got to discuss this. I think we were at the early stages of the project, maybe before we started the project, but the question came up. I think I raised the question about resistance in Central Asia on the part of the citizens to, you know, greater Chinese investment, and he couldn't quite get it. Now, this is anecdotal and so on and so forth, but it does dovetail with what you're describing. He couldn't quite get it. He sort of said, I don't understand why they would resist. Like, this is win-win, right? How could you possibly have any other view of this, right? Remember George W. Bush, like, couldn't understand why they hate us so much, right? After 9/11, right? It's like, you know, again, not justifying the acts, but the point is it's not simply a question of getting the message across properly, right? And then this gentleman in the delegation, I don't know if you remember this, decided that it was a function of fake news. Right, and at the time, fake news was not something that was on everybody's lips, but nonetheless, here we are, and so there was a sense that at least this person was unwilling to hear that anything other than the sort of, you know, throwing roses at the great initiatives was happening, and so I think that's consistent. Now, maybe that in a way gets to the first question. I don't. Did you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not. Tell me if I'm interpreting your question correctly. I think what you were trying to say is that this is a development aid, and it ought to be welcomed, and it's sort of puzzling that it's not. Is that what I'm
looking at it as a manner of justification, because when I think it was Diana was seeing, I mean, that to me is actually fascinating, seeing China's development growth, because it's transactional, it's transformative, it is and it is not. There's policy, there's an ethos, and one does not know. As China engorges, as US recedes for a variety of reasons, it's going to make things very interesting. Okay. And I just used Mahan justification in terms of then they were building battleships, because then they understood why, because the water, it had routes, it had use, it has social uses, military use, and economic use. Okay. Somewhat analogous. Maybe I'm pushing it too far.
Okay, that's an interesting comment. Yeah.
Well, this might be a little bit of a shift, but I just want to share one last anecdote that I think might be interesting, that is kind of from the other side. So in geography, Jamie Peck often says there are the lumpers and the splitters. And what he means is, you know, conceptually and of course, he's being overly simplistic in his take on this, but his larger point is that most scholars are trying overall to do one or the other, largely. And what I think this book tries to do is lump and split. and split and then lump back together. That is to really look at all those contingencies and those differences, and then try to say, what does this tell us about how the Belt and Road is rolling out? And why it's important, and this is the anecdote, is I spoke to a woman who had done many years of research in the mountains of Nepal on the rollout there of a road. And she speaks the language extraordinarily well. She's done many, many years of field work there. She leads local scholars through fieldwork trips in these mountains. And I said, but what about the military buildup? Because the perception on from the perspective of the people who were in her fieldwork and who she knows so well was that this was great. The road was coming, the money was coming. Please welcome the BRI to our mountain community. And she really hadn't read, and this is not a scholar any of us in this room know, but she really hadn't read the geopolitical or the political science analysis of all the military buildup that had enabled that road to be built in that particular way. So to me, the reason I wanted to just end with that is to say lumping and splitting conceptually have a lot to offer one another, and you can't know anything completely from any one place.
I wonder whether between the lumping and the splitting, they're the liquefiers. I mean, which would work with a stream, right?
And the flow.
Yeah. Question.
Thank you for the book and the discussion. Professor Silvey sort of raised up the question, is BRI just a plain old capitalist expansion? So I'd like to take that up. Last week on this campus, there was a symposium talking about the situation in Xinjiang, China. There is a mass internment of the Uyghurs and Kazakh in Xinjiang. And there was an American anthropologist who spoke, and his paper title, he teaches in a Canadian university. His title is, why is it important to frame oppression in Xinjiang as a global racial / colonial capitalism? So I posed a questions to him, going back a bit of history, that in 2013, the BRI was declared or launched. Then by 2017, Beijing imposed the re-education camps in Xinjiang. And so I posed a question to that professor. He didn't answer my question. I think that the Manchu colonial Qing dynasty, and then later on, Beijing, a so-called pacified Xinjiang. And then after 2013 and after onwards 2017, Beijing sort of ran the BRI through Xinjiang into the Central Asian republics. So I asked him, what is his take? Why he used that term global racial / colonial capitalism, but he couldn't answer me. Perhaps he didn't look into BRI. So I'm going to read that book because there are two sections, especially on Xinjiang and the Central Asian republics, like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Do you want to see if there are other, or we could? Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe if like a woman or a student wanted to ask.
Or a student.
A woman or a student?
Yes, that'd be
Or a
nice.
woman student.
Yeah, or a woman student.
Not to put anyone on the spot.
I'd like to know how the local civil society will react to this Belt and Road project.
Thank you. Well, I can speak from my own field work. This isn't actually represented in the book, but I've been looking at Indonesia's responses to recent investments, specifically around the high-speed rail between Bandung and Jakarta. And in its initial rollout, when the train was being planned and the land was being accumulated for the train, there was a lot of civil society response. Not directed at China per se, but just directed at the people taking the land. And now, however, and that was actually very rapidly dealt with, and that's a story in itself. Now the general vibe about the train is great national pride and appreciation of the engineers and the people who are have brought this incredible high-speed train to their community. So that's an interesting dynamic. Sort of the moment really matters. The moment when you ask the question, what is civil society response? What is local response? That it changes quite quickly, and it changes based on who's been evicted, who's been excluded from the process.
Experience sharing between the governments and the developers, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that wasn't from the book.
But what is lacking, I think, here is the civil society's communication and the experience sharing. I think Chinese people often feel blocked by Chinese government from communicating with the international community, especially independent civil society. So.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. I mean, we don't really systematically look at patterns of civil society, but it comes up in many of the chapters. Just speaking about Central Asia, and this is reflected in some of the chapters, but also my own work. I mean, look, it's one of those situations where it's a force that's hard to resist. This is especially as Russia, let's say, redefines its role in the neighborhood. China seems like the better bet. Not to mention the fact that, and let's not forget this point, that there are public goods that were not being created before China came along and decided to offer its assistance. Now, we could talk about the quality of the goods that are being created in the aftermath, and then we could talk about the downstream effects. So even on this question of how does civil society react, I mean, you can do polls and you can watch them, the reactions in different years in terms of, what do you think about China kinds of questions. But so much depends upon on where you are. If I'm in southeast Kazakhstan near the Chinese border and hanging out with truckers or in the service industries that sort of surround this newly rapid trade along the roads that have been constructed with Chinese money, nothing but good things, right? Nothing but good things. But go to the next town over, those who are not involved directly in that. And then it's, what are all these trucks bypassing us with their goods that are going off to Europe or some other destination? It's not benefiting us, right? So the reaction, and it's hard to, again, get a real foothold on sort of how much of each, but there's certainly plenty of variety in these kinds of contexts. There are the cheerleaders, and then there are those who are much more critical. I did want to link this question about, Xinjiang and in a way to Jeremy's comments, because look, I don't know what the phrase was he was talking about, racial capital, okay, so I don't know what I know.
He also used the term terror capitalism.
Okay, I don't know what that is, but I will say that to me, there's no question that there's something that you might, like, is China acting as an empire, right? It's kind of a question that we more or less sidestep. Certainly it is in certain places, and in Xinjiang, it seems hard to describe it in any kind of other terms. But is it the same in Sri Lanka? Is it the same in Switzerland? Is it the same? No, it's certainly not, right? Overall, is China an empire? We don't bother with that kind of overall characterization. But there is throughout, I would say, kind of an imperial hubris, right? And there's a hubris that our model is the only model. There's an inability to see something else, right? It's a matter of sort of, adjustments around the edges, that the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and other minorities in Xinjiang should recognize how glorious the development model is, right? Okay, I obviously don't buy into that, but that's the hubris, right? That's the hubris. And then it probably, and maybe I'm guessing a little bit, but it links up to your comments, Jeremy, which is that it leads to an inability to truly learn from. Now, this is not the only great power that suffers from imperial hubris. Maybe that comes with the territory, but I would say that's probably what's at play here.
Mm-hmm. And then I think a really other important part of this is, when we're talking about what does the Belt and Road sort of mean to these different places and people, we're not then coming back to say, what does this tell us about the CCP? Actually, that is really not what the book tries to do. Also, it doesn't try to say anything about Chinese people. So another really important piece for all these places is that there have been intermarriages and adoptions, and there are people all over Indonesia who have roots in southern China, and it's not as though there's an overt, distinct separation, though there has been violence and extreme ethnic tension. So that's really an important piece of what the book doesn't aim to try to do. So it's important at the end to be able to say what we're not doing.
I was wondering, like, jumping off of recent news with Trump being in office, do you think that his constant impending tariff threats and other threats generate incentive or fuels for like typical Western allies to consider investing or even joining in the BRI? Do you think that's like a factor?
Absolutely. I mean, well, what I see anyway is a lot of, dealing across nations, obviously. Yeah, and more that's happening, in ways we can see on the front pages. We don't have to dig very deep to see that. But when you start to look a little bit further, you can say, well, what flag are they raising in this particular development project? Are they raising the flag or the banner of the BRI? Or are they raising a different flag or banner in this development project? I think that distinction is really important. And then which ideology does that flag or that project try to sort of stand on?
Just brief comment on that. I mean, speaking of flags in a different sense, I mean, to the extent that China has this network of relationships, some better developed than others, it now has the potential to try to evade these tariffs by re-flagging, I guess, their goods as being from Vietnam, from Laos, and so on, right? I don't know the mechanics, and I don't know how easy or hard that sort of thing is, but we've seen some news reports on that. So I mean, we're going to see all kinds of different things. So this is not it's not only the BRI that generates downstream effects. It's also, radical change in other great powers, for sure. And the interaction between the two is the space to be looking at going forward.
I want to follow up on that student's excellent question, and then really pick up on what you said first, Ed, your comment about downstream and Musk. And empirically, I kind of doubt that's true. I think Trump is behaving as Trump would if the RI did not exist. But I do wonder on its broader effects, and this follows what the student said. Now that the United States is behaving like fantasy of post-colonial critiques and revisionist Cold War history. This is the monster that they were describing in the 90s that didn't exist, it now exists. What are the broader implications for Beijing? My guess would be it hugely increases its strength, not merely the BRI, but generally, and I'm thinking of my space of the world, Western Europe. And there's a very strong corporate element in Germany that opposes decoupling from China. I think they've won the argument now that the US is rolling out tariffs. So China's trade with and perhaps influence on Western Europe, and that's a little candidate for that, I think will likely grow. So do you agree? And to Diana's the China expert.
There's my
how can I disagree with you, Randall? No, I think there is, yes, it's true that Trump's isolationism creates a power vacuum that China has already filled and will continue to fill. Yes. However, I think because I studied domestic politics, I think China will also be constrained and is being constrained by its domestic problems, especially with economic problems right now. Right. So China's economy has been suffering since post-COVID. It hasn't really been recovering. They've tried to cover it up by muffling economists who actually say the economy is not growing as much as it should be growing. And all of this costs money. All this BRI stuff costs money, even though they've tried to pivot from more, really non-income generating projects like infrastructure projects to more income generating things like EVs and stuff like that, it still costs a lot of money. And so if you don't have, if the economy is tanking, then I think that internal constraint will temper this trend of like, oh, then China's just going to take over everything because it's internally constrained.
I agree. Oh, hang on, Liz has a question, but let me just really briefly to Professor Hanson. No, I agree in general, although the US is not a reliable partner anymore, but I don't think we necessarily should assume that the tariffs are here and here to stay beyond, well, we don't know. I mean, I think, well, let me back up. If I'm a policymaker, I do assume, right? And no matter where I am, that the tariffs are here and here to stay. But I think a lot can change. I think that, again, if, the 10% tariffs on China, can they be absorbed? Does that fundamentally alter things? How, which part of the tariffs are simply tactical and are, an opportunity for Trump to win something? Jeremy's shaking his head. I don't know the answer to this. No, maybe Donald Trump doesn't know the answer to this. I mean, if I'm betting in your direction, but with just a tiny asterisk that I think we don't really know. And I'd wonder what the threshold is for the German industrialists or, the outfits you have in mind to do a fundamental pivot. Right, because that comes with its own hassles and considerations, right? I'm not sure that that's risk-free either, right?
I think my question is back to the title of C, and you were talking about sort of the story behind this image, right? That I'm thinking about how seeing China's Belt and Road, or seeing which image of what we see in whether it's our experience or in any image, as begin to relate it to the Belt and Road, it's not always going to be visually obvious, right? Because it's so pervasive and it's so multi-layered. It's not just, for example, sometimes it's mega project, right? So I'm just really curious about whether there are examples of forgetting, right? Forgetting that it's China's Belt and Road when something becomes so localized. Also, as sort of has been gestured towards, so deep in local politics, whether it's local corruption, local political change, that even if it was China's Belt and Road by whether it's economies, where the money came from, etc., that there's actually a forgetting. And I guess what that means for the different kinds of visibility that your project is sort of gesturing us or teaching us to see.
Thanks so much for the question. Yes, I think that's a really great way for us to, I want to respond just to say, forgetting and the invisibility, the politics of invisibility, and people not knowing where the investment came from, who it came from, or how to track it back. And that's the majority. Really, most of what is going on, people don't associate with a flag or a state or even a corporation. And I think that probably gives us a lot of grist for future work. It's sort of, thinking about when also at what moment something does become visible as Chinese and then not, or an American investment and not. And those moments of visibility, cinema studies probably has a lot to offer to geographers and political scientists to think about all those representations. So thank you for that question.
I don't know. I'm thinking that we have a reception. And
thank you for exactly. Before we thank our editors and everyone concerned, I'd like to point out that we have a reception, and you're very much invited to join us in the next room.
We'd like to see you there.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for coming. Thank you for engaging.